Acest loc de oficialități unde se lansează campania Vizitați Laos în 2024. Și corp diplomatic cât cuprinde, televiziunea locală, fițet și poliție militară, bineînțeles, și strălucitori cât cuprinde.
$3.5 million people visited Laos People's Democratic Republic in 2023. I was one of them in November, attending the opening of the Visit Laos 2024 ceremony. Wait, how do you get to film at an official ceremony in a totalitarian communist country? Well, you just show up. Nobody asks, nobody cares. On paper, nobody should come here. There's red flags everywhere, there's an all too familiar coat of arms, the constitutional framework is eerily similar to the one of North Korea, featuring a supreme leader, a politburo, no democratic controls, and it's one of the world's 5 remaining nominally communist countries alongside with People's Republic of China, North Korea, Cuba and Vietnam. Yet, unlike North Korea, China, or even Cuba, people do flock here in increasingly frightening numbers. In 2019, almost 5 million people visited Laos, and in the first 3 months of 2024, over 1 million people thought it's a good idea to land here and move around. Sure, the number is according to the Ministry of Information, Culture and Tourism, but even if you don't believe them, a quick stroll through Vientiane does lend some credence to this. To make the comparison with DPRK even more shocking, the second reason people come here, after the natural landscapes, is the food. That is to say, not only such things as food shortages are unimaginable to most people alive in Laos today, but the local food is in itself a tourist attraction. Also, unlike North Korea or China, the state doesn't really care that much what you do as a visitor or what you videotape, which is very rare in authoritarian countries, especially the ones who fly the hammer and sickle seemingly unironically. And then you meet the people, and that's when it hits you. Nobody really cares here. Just don't mess around with their food and their religion, and you'll be fine. Welcome to Laos DPR, the most laid-back place on earth where everything you thought you know doesn't apply. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the second featured installment of the Khmer Series. When the plans were made for this tour, the only fixed destination was Cambodia, but as always, hitting a neighboring country is preferable. The choices were Vietnam, which I hope to do by the end of this decade, Thailand, which is too big and it's a place too many people go to, so it wouldn't bring too much value, and Laos DPR, where from a Western perspective, no one goes there. Except that's not exactly true. About a third of the visitors do come from Europe, especially Germany, and the former colonial overlord, France. In fact, there are more European and American visitors than Chinese, even though there are multiple direct trains per day from China to Vientiane, and the train goes through the main visitor hotspots as well. With that said, Laos is an acquired taste. Most of the visitors you encounter are people who have returned, and one of the main reasons they do return is for the people. Now look, if you ask me quickly how many countries I visited, I may not know the answer. Let's just say that it takes a lot for something to stand out to me, especially when it comes to people, which is why I can make these videos. I can casually gloss over violent incidents, weird behaviors, weird habits, or fake politeness without letting any of that affect how I think about a certain place, which is how I ended up despising places like Switzerland despite so much pressure to claim in public that it's a nice place, or how I ended up really liking Uzbekistan despite some of the less pleasant aspects of it. But when it comes to the Laosian people, it's impossible not to notice and not to let it color your thinking. It's also impossible not to then notice just how much the history of this remote place makes perfect sense once you've met the Laosian people. So this is arguably the most laid-back place on Earth. I say arguably because I haven't yet been everywhere. So maybe there are countries or places more laid-back than Laos out there, but honestly, it's hard to believe. The stereotypes about this region are relatively similar to the ones applied to Southeast Asia in general. Hard-working, collectivistic, obedient to authority, bad drivers, intelligent but socially inept, and focused on academic achievement. Well, some of those are true in Cambodia. Laos somehow manages to break almost all of them. Public approval of capitalism here is in the high 90s, in line with the whole region and much higher than almost all of Europe, so not too collectivistic. Obedience to authority is a straight-up joke. When I first landed in Vientiane, I was texted by my embassy warning me that Laos has a death penalty for drug offenses. Well, that's not surprising, this is the norm for this region. What was surprising was that immediately after exiting the airport, the air smelled like weed for the whole evening, everywhere, regardless of the area of the town, but especially here in the second wealthiest special economic zone. The name sounds like the Chinese system, but the practice is entirely different. What special economic zone actually means in Laos is basically, here's this plot of land, go wild, make money, and give us a fixed amount. It's not Ancapistan per se, but for a European socialist it would feel as such for sure. Even so, not even this wild opportunity gets the Laosians too excited, just more punctual than the state employees. And that's how we get to the work ethic. Laosians' work ethic is a mixture of Spanish, although there is no mandatory siesta period, but there is a de facto one, though less observed lately according to the locals, then a mixture of French, but without the strikes, and a very distinct local flavor. Now, historically, that brought quite a few disadvantages, especially in the early years of the country, but through postmodernity, it's been serving them really well. Laosians' lack of enthusiasm for work or ideology meant that communism de facto failed within 4 or 5 years. De jure, the party renounced economic Marxism in under 10 years since its first attempt to implement it. Half-hearted communism. We'll get into that in more details in the next episode. But everything is half-hearted here, except the family and electricity. Unlike neighboring Cambodia, experiencing blackouts here is comparatively rare. In fact, the country is a net exporter of electricity to all of its neighbors, and it's one of the things that brings income to the government. There is no VAT in practice, though the government is adamant in claiming to the contrary. Income tax is so trivial to avoid that the government doesn't even try to enforce it, and capital gains taxes, although easy to collect, are simply not enough. Good enough for government work could very well be the motto for most of the activities in this country. Although slightly better for the private sector, the average Laosian will only work as much as it is absolutely necessary, and as little time as possible. They don't think this is revolutionary. It's how they've always been doing things since forever because, as mentioned in the first episode, this is a nation constructed of 3 ethnic groups from China and Cambodia who really didn't like the excesses of those 2 countries, and so they formed their own. And the reason they do things this way is so they have time to focus on the other thing that is not half-hearted here: family. They have slightly more children than Europeans, but a lot less than Central Asians, for instance. But they do like their families in a way that you don't see in neighboring China or Thailand. Even in the capital city at night, you can stumble upon one or two street family party. Quite fascinating, especially when I met the director of a big company at one of them in a neighborhood you wouldn't expect to meet such a person. So that would be another area where Laotians routinely defy regional stereotypes. The regional stereotype is that classism is the norm, especially when it comes to marriage and family. Well, this is less true in Laos. It happens, but the rigidity is just not there. The laid-back nature of Laotians seeps into everything, from governance to day-to-day interactions and everything you can imagine in between. Bad drivers? Yeah, but not really, compared to Phnom Penh, where, as you can see, I had to be extra alert all the time while being outside due to the chaotic and quite dangerous traffic. Laos is just not like that. Sure, there's less discipline in traffic, but I've never seen anyone getting annoyed in traffic, and I sought the hotspots for accidents just so maybe I catch something on the camera, all to no avail. The government just hopes to convince more people to at least try not to drive after they've done drugs. In fact, I didn't see anyone getting annoyed at anything at all in the 2 weeks in the country. Well, except for the tourists. Now, to be fair, oftentimes the tourists are annoying and wrong, but it's also hard not to get annoyed when you're told a random objective is now suddenly closed in the middle of the day because potato. What's the matter? Just come back 2 hours from now, or tomorrow. All while there's 45 degrees Celsius outside and you're in a less densely populated area of the city like this one. This is me waiting for the National Museum to open up. Now, I don't regret waiting, though, because I got shots like these. You see, the regime may be half-hearted with the local population, that includes the immigrants, but they still love Maoist and leftist useful idiots in the West who do the bidding for Asian communists. They love them so much that they feature them in official propaganda, because that's exactly what this museum is. But more on that in the next episode. And then there's the education part. The stereotypes about Asians and education don't apply at all in Laos. Globalist institutions and the communist government in Vientiane have been trying for decades to convince Laotians to value indoctrination centers, otherwise known as schools, but to no avail. Now, that's not to say Laotians don't get an education, they do, but they just have a more relaxed attitude to it. And if anything, that attitude has gotten more relaxed, not less, in the last 30 years. I say in the last 30 years because 1994 is the turning point here, when the party adopted a series of reforms that gradually lifted Laos from a marginal backwater to an economy that's every year in the top 20 most dynamic in the world, and 95% of the populace owns property, the absolute highest in the world. Of course, you'll be hard-pressed to find details about Laotians' attitude to education, especially if you don't speak Laotian or Khmer, because pretty much everything written in English on this topic is written by a state actor or Laotian Americans with a chip on their shoulder trying to fit the generic Asian American stereotype. But you can easily notice this while moving around the country. Nearly everyone is handy in some way, shape, or form. That includes the upper class, too. Nearly everyone is normal in the head, or as Westerners would put it, have street smarts, and almost nobody introduces himself with their academic titles, even if they have them. The two biggest universities in the country are in fact under 30 years old. Contrary to other communist regimes elsewhere in the world, from China to USSR and to Eastern Europe, the regime in Vientiane ended up reflecting the people, so didn't quite rush to establish new universities. If anything, the communists abolished the only degree awarding institution that existed in the country, the Sisa Vangong University, named after the last king of the Luang Prabang Kingdom. This decision was the least controversial made by the communist regime. The biggest universities in the country right now are the National University of Laos, founded in 1996 and whose students are overwhelmingly foreign, and the Subhanumvong University, located in Luang Prabang and named after the first president of Laos, who also happened to be a prince and a communist. Yeah, here's another half-hearted thing. Royal figures were also communists here, well, at least some of them. To make things even more ironic, Prince Subhanwong was educated in France, which was one of the reasons he agreed with the Laosian people that higher education is mostly dogshit. Yet in 2003, almost 20 years after his death, the regime named the country's second university after him. Nobody sees the irony in this either, because few can be bothered to care, quite frankly. Youngsters in Laos flock to the trades: logistics, commerce, manufacturing, and maybe applied engineering, which is a nice way of saying more manufacturing and logistics. Now, mind you, I'm not saying this is necessarily good, but I am saying that the net result is dynamic economic growth, very few weird ideologies among the youth, contrasting China here quite a bit, and an overall down-to-earth populace. This is, of course, a problem for the regime, because a populace that can be legit self-reliant and a regime that is half-hearted means a lot of clownery. How do you survive as a regime if everyone, including state apparatchiks, views being paid under the table as inherently good, or at least not something to be bothered with? And I don't mean bribes, although there's plenty of that too, as you would expect, but just existing as an economic actor without giving two hoots about the opinions of the state. Now that is something that I like, but the regime certainly doesn't. And that's the context by which you see a lot of scenes like these. Chinese contractors bringing in their own workforce, thus bypassing the society. For now, nobody cares, but probably the third protest will be against this. So, what is the third protest? Well, I was joking with a fine Dutchman I met in Luang Prabang that if protests were to erupt in this country, even those would be interrupted somewhere around 1 p.m. for a lunch break and would only last until maybe 7 p.m. because afterwards everyone would go home to be with their families. Laosians aren't really into protesting the way neighboring countries are. While none of the countries in the region are democracies, protests and public displays of discontent are fairly common in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. Heck, even in China lately they're more common. But in Laos, this only happened twice, in 1977 and 2022. In both cases, outside and foreign observers were hoping this would turn into a full rebellion against communist rule, but fun fact, no. In 1977, it was about religious freedom. The communist regime was trying to regulate Buddhism to prevent the Thai schools of thought from entering the country. Why? Because Thai Buddhism is explicitly and occasionally virulently and violently anti-communist. The protests of 77 ended with a compromise. The Lao People's Revolutionary Party not only gets out of religious affairs, but also ends up subsidizing the upkeep of all temples and cools down the paranoia about monks schooled in Thailand. I know it doesn't sound like a compromise, but more like the protesters got everything they wanted, but that's how the party sees it. The second time there were protests in Laos was in 2022, and again foreign observers hoped this would topple the regime, as you can see from this long analysis published by CFR. It all started with protests against COVID policy. Unlike China, Laos didn't have lockdowns or any of the kabuki theater that so many other countries on earth adopted, but Laos did close its borders. Well, to legitimate visitors anyway. The heroin trade from Myanmar went on unimpeded, of course. And the closing of the borders collapsed the incomes from tourism and had a terrible knock-on effects on all facets of the economy. So by 2022, Laosians have had enough because one of the two important pillars from them had been touched: food. And since there was already some protesting mood, why not protest about other things as well, such as corruption, incompetence, and, well, inflation. All three good points, mind you. While here, I bought multiple prints of the Vientiane Times, the only English-language newspaper. This is the first edition from 1994. It used to cost 700 kip. In November 2023, the same paper was 5,500 kip. Sure, not Zimbabwe tier level of inflation, but the public is not wrong to blame the government for it. Also, unlike China, the regime in Vientiane is simply incapable of doing any kind of effective censorship, even if they want to, and a lot in the regime do. So in practice, the information space in Laos is probably the freest in the region simply due to incompetence. This also means organizing protests is easier than it had been in the past. Even so, the mood fizzled out pretty quickly without any heavy-handed interventions. Still, the possibility of a third protest is higher than ever, precisely on what I was saying earlier, the influx of Chinese contractors bypassing any input from the communities by bribing local Lao politicians. We've been seeing a bit more of these lately, which would have been unimaginable 2 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. And to be fair, it is the number one issue to protest about, even though it's not clear-cut. Yes, of course, China acts in a predatory manner here, but China is also the main lender to the country and the main builder of infrastructure. I may not like it, but it's true. I wouldn't have been able to cover so much ground in Laos without the Chinese trains. Yes, they're worse than they look like, and boarding one of these is a nightmare, but at least they sort of run. Prior to these, navigating Laos was a task more difficult than navigating Romania in the 1980s. All of this laid-back attitude doesn't have just positives. Earlier in the video, I mentioned the heroin trade. As this distinguished audience is keenly aware, Laos borders Myanmar and Thailand. Thailand is a destination for hard drugs as well as a port for sending them everywhere else in the world. Production, however, is rarely in Thailand. It's almost always in Myanmar and Laos. And with the current civil war in Myanmar, with the military junta being weakened, the drug producers and drug lords can basically move around more or less unimpeded. What you may not be aware of is this area, the Golden Triangle, not to be confused with a special economic zone with the same name that is inside Laos. This area, home of the Wa minority in Burma or Myanmar, is a de facto independent state, propped up by the DEA at some point, ironically. A lot of authors blame the CIA or the CCP, but it was really the Drug Enforcement Agency that ended up creating this little drug empire. To give you an idea, the army of this place is bigger than Sweden's and is more technologically advanced than its neighbors. Sure, it doesn't have nukes, but it does have pretty much everything else. Everyone knows this in the region, especially the Lao government and people, and while they'd like this to no longer be a problem, well, the laid-back attitude kinda prevents that. And that attitude seeps into law enforcement quite severely. The positive side of it is that I could videotape these images. Across the river is Thailand. In a communist country, videotaping like that on a border area is absolutely haram. Law enforcement officers just wanted a lighter and were surprised I was smoking a local brand of cigarettes. The negative side of this is that law enforcement has the same attitude towards the drug lords that use Laos as a transit hub. Oftentimes, bribes are not even involved. They just can't be bothered. The point I'm trying to make with these stories is that there are trade-offs associated to being excessively laid back as a society, just like there are trade-offs to being a society of nosy Karens that produces burdensome regulations and depressing outcomes. Still, trade-offs notwithstanding, violent crime is very rare in Laos. So while everything is de facto permitted, not much messed up things end up happening. It's definitely the safest country I visited in the last decade. The worst thing witnessed was a bunch of locals at the border mildly raising the tone at the border officials for being inept. Because, again, pretty much nothing seems to piss off these people in public. So, ultimately, this explains why Laos, despite its interesting politics, is rarely in the news today. It also explains why most of the visitors are returnees who explicitly seek the quietness of this place. Admittedly, I didn't go to Vang Vieng, which is the main tourist hotspot that is not in some remote natural reservation, but I did go to Luang Prabang, the historical capital of the country, and this is the most animated part. There are villages in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand that are more animated than Laosian cities. It's not that nightlife is forbidden. It isn't. It's just that it's centered around family and clan celebrations. If you know where those happen, you get to have a good time, under the condition that you don't videotape. so I didn't. For a country with relatively short history and a median age of just 24, Laos is surprisingly quiet in a way no other similar country is. Cambodia's median age is only slightly higher at 26, but the outcomes are totally different. So, from a political and sociological perspective, Laos is very interesting. It defies pretty much every expectation and almost every hypothesis. Younger countries tend to be more rowdy, and almost all are, but then there's Laos. Communist countries tend to either grow increasingly repressive or turn into de facto capitalist countries. But then there's Laos, which on paper grew increasingly repressive, but is also a de facto capitalist country, and nobody seems to care. Southeast Asians are really into academic achievement while eschewing social aptitudes. But then there's Laos, which is exactly the opposite. Because reasons. Pretty much any stereotype or even established academic theory you can think of in sociology, economics, and politics, you can expect it to be challenged by the reality in Laos. So, while for tourism it's only interesting for those seeking peace and quietness, and maybe an opportunity to pat the elephant, for politics, Laos is the place to challenge your assumptions. Pick your assumption and then check it in Laos. More often than not, it doesn't apply. And in the next episode, we'll take a much closer look on why and how. Because the construction of the People's Democratic Republic is also quite unique in the history of communist regimes. The beginning is similar to others, but how it carried on simply isn't. And it's all because of this guy, Keizom Phomvihan. I use the Chinese pronunciation because, well, at his house, recording is not permitted. And even though he's the de facto founder of the modern nation, there's almost nothing in English about this guy. Even the Marxists' page barely has 3 lines on him, even though his regime is arguably the most successful, at least in terms of still being around without gulags and repression. You would think the Marxists would appreciate that. So yeah, in the next episode we'll go through the particularity of Laos' general half-heartedness. Half-hearted communism. But until then, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Many thanks to the donor circle. And if you like this kind of content, please do consider supporting the next series, which will focus a bit more on the drug trade as we're heading to Latin America. And with that, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.